A laugh like shivered glass slid through the hedgerows and did not belong to any hearth cup or merrymaking. It rang thin and bright beneath an ordinary moon and carried with it a taste of wrongness. Men in Brie raised their heads from the doors of their inns, and dogs curled once upon their haunches and whined. A milkmaid paused with her pail half lifted and felt, as if by a small electric touch, that the world had changed its terms. In that laugh was a promise, not of joy, but of a bargain. Merriment will no longer be merely harmless. Where it passed, smiles thinned into knives of inquiry, and the old pledges between neighbor and neighbor trembled like leaves in a wind that had learned a new direction. It came to town in a caravan of oddities, garlands of bells and pennants, canvas with painted eyes, and wheels that squeaked a nonsense tune. The wagons creaked over the cartways and left a line of thin purple dust behind them, as though the road itself had borne some stain that a broom could not erase. At the head of that company rode a man who was no man of the north, no stock of Hobbit or Dunedain. He wore motley the color of bruised plums and moonlight. His hair was green as moss in spring and stood in tumble. His face was painted as if by a child's hand, white as clapboard, red at the mouth, dark about the eyes. When he moved, the crowd's breath drew in. When he laughed, the laughter split and made rooms in the air. They called him many names the next morning, trickster, jester, fool, but he answered to none of them. He asked for no coin. He asked instead for confidences. He traded tricks for secrets, small shadow for small truth. He would prod a Maugham's memory with a painted card and make him remember a thing he had never meant to tell. He would jingle a set of keys and coax from a housewife the shape of a quarrel long shelved. People leaned in as if the sound of his voice held honey. A child gave him a wooden horse, and he gave back a riddle that tugged at the child's heart. An old soldier confessed a dream from the wars and was given a toy sword that whispered doubts when the bearer slept. The bargains were light as breath and bound as iron. Gandalf sat in the doorway of an inn and watched with a steady eye. He had come to Brie for other reasons, paths of counsel and the exchange of tidings, but he put his pipe down and held his cup as if something were being brewed besides ale. From the start, the incident looked like folly, and the mind of the wizard read it as danger. There was no malice in the painted man's mirth. Not at first. The thing that made the hair at Gandalf's temples stand up was a cold pattern beneath the mirth, a cunning as precise as a smith's. The jester prodded at the seams of trust. He put a jest here and a whisper there, and watched how one small laughter unstitched an old seam until a whole cloak of custom hung in tatters. The first time a joke became an accusation, it did so in a market square under a painted arch, where apples shone like small suns. The jester produced a puppet that mimed a man taking coin from a purse. The puppet's hands were long and clever, and they could not be stopped. A woman in the crowd pointed at the baker, and the puppet bowed to the gesture as if to plead guilty. A neighbor who had once lent a sum in better times remembered only the puppet's hands and not the kettle of gold the baker had spent to help with a sick child. The word moved like smoke. He took, said one voice. He hid, said another. Within an hour, the baker's door had been nailed and a notice of theft nailed to the lintel. The puppet slunk into the wagons and was given a theater of evening mist in which to vanish. So it went. A jest about a Maugham's temper became a supposition that he had struck his wife a trick with mirrors, suggested that someone kept a secret lover beneath the thatch, a riddle about shadows turned into talk of old pacts, of debts to strangers from far off. The jester did not shout accusations, he planted them like seeds. The townsfolk, who had been polite enough to laugh, found in themselves an appetite to feed those seeds. They began to watch one another as if each neighbor might be a stage upon which some small treachery could be acted. Hushed confidences were turned into gossiping bonfires. Fist and tongue took up work that law and promise had once done. Gandalf observed the pattern as a healer would observe fever. He listened for the source beneath each new alarm, and he saw certain habits that spoke of design. The jester left marks, ribbons with a painted eye tied to gates, little cards folded into coin purses, a bit of violet dye on a threshing stone. They were not simply tokens of play, they were like a painter's strokes that, when seen from a distance, made an image one could not miss. Those marks arranged themselves into a map. The road north, then the lane by the mill, then the hollow where the hedgerows grew dense. He traced them with eyes like a hound's, slow and patient. They threaded away from the comfort of the inn and toward places where the moonlight lay thin. It was not mere mischief, Gandalf felt. He had watched misrule and had seen foul hearts at work. This was different. The jester's jokes did not end with laughter, but with doubt. They were games played in a manner that forced the pieces into violence. Where a man had once been secure in his name, there was now a question that could be answered only by defense or by flight. That way lay ruin. A village could be rent and left without a reed to bind it, all by the simplest of pranks, guided by a mind that savored fracture. He rose then, slow as a man who cares for nothing but to see a thing done rightly. He wrapped his cloak about him, the night had gone colder, and a fog hugged the road like a shawl. The innkeeper muttered when Gandalf left a gold piece upon the table, and a serving maid followed him with eyes wide as lanterns, as if to ask why the wizard took such an interest in a fool's caravan. Fools are often servants of greater things, he told her, in a voice that was both gentle and grave. She could not tell whether he spoke encouragement or warning. Gandalf walked the lanes by starlight, and his staff tapped the earth with a patient rhythm. The caravan's prints were easy to find if one looked. The wheels left a faint shimmer of purple where the dust had been spilled, and the horses' hooves bore the smell of grease paint and sweetmeats. He did not call after the wagons. He had no need of haste. A trickster who sought to unsettle would often show his hand to those who watched too hotly. There is craft in patient following. He moved instead with the solitude that a shepherd takes when he seeks the lost lamb beneath a low sky. As he passed the old stone cross that marked the road, a child peered from a hedge and asked him, voice high with simple fear, "Does he hurt the painted man?" Gandalf knelt and looked into the small face. He could see the child's small teeth in the moonlight, and the child's hands were clenched about a rabbit's foot charm. "He hurts what he cannot hold," the wizard said, and the child did not comprehend, but felt the answer as if it were heat. Gandalf rose with the child's prayer knotted in his breast, and he set his face toward the east. The trail led him away from the well-known ways. The hedgerows thickened. Where the moon would have fallen in a steady white sheet, it now seemed swallowed by a leaning gloom, as if some watchful thing bent low to listen. The road narrowed to a lane, and the lane to a track that worried at the roots of older trees. Here the signs of laughter grew less like festivities and more like snares. Bells woven into brambles, a clown's hat draped over a broken stone, footprints that circled and overlapped as if to confuse a pursuer. Gandalf's fingers tightened about his staff. He smelled something like burnt sugar and iron. In the drifting air he thought he heard a faint piping, music that had no tune but that delighted in being off the key. He thought of the old tales of men who sowed chaos for sport. Their names are seldom remembered, but their deeds make songs of sorrow. This one had the steadiness of a man choosing his field. He was not content to frighten, he wished to rearrange. The jester did not simply break a door, he made the door suspicious. He did not only point a finger, he taught others to point theirs. Where once there was an order of law and safeguard, now there crept the small, bright corrosions of suspicion that would eat at the beams of community, if left unchecked. Gandalf paused at the fork where the lane divided, and he set his staff to the ground and thought. He could turn back to the warm circles of Bree and sound an alarm. He could gather men and make watchfires and drive the jesters' wagons from the town like scattered leaves. Yet he knew, by slow knowledge honed over long years, that to fight a method with merely force is to lend the method new power. A wise enemy makes his foe's anger part of his plan. The true remedy would be to follow the trick to its source and unmask its design. If the heart of the jest could be shown to be hollow, then laughter might be made to fall away. So he chose to go forward. He took with him neither sword nor great company. What he carried was his attention, his memory of names and old promises, and that small, inexorable will to see an injustice mended. The tracks of the wagons bent now toward a denser country, a hollowing of the woods where the trees grew close and the stars lost their teeth. There were darker portents in the air at the edge of that wood, an uneasy silence where birds should have called, and the pricking of dead leaves on limbs where no wind blew. The purple dust dwindled in its place, lay faint marks as of a foot that danced. He walked into that waiting dark, and with each step he felt the jester's influence ripple outward like a stone's thrown ring. Behind him, Bree sat under the moon, its lights bright and its doors bolted, yet some windows remained bare, as if a mother listened for a child's cry that had not yet been made. Gandalf did not look back. His will was set upon finding the source of the mirth and learning whether law and decency could stand against its cunning. The road before him grew narrower and the night deeper. He tightened his cloak and stepped on, following the laughter into the places where laughter wore a mask, and the mask began to speak. Silence did not fall so much as settle like ash, finding new corners. The chairs around Elrond's table held the shapes of those who had been seated in them, but their voices had thinned to careful murmurs and the quick, uncertain catching of breath. Outside, the deep waters of the Bruinen moved without sound, and inside the lamplight trembled on carved wood as if even the beams listened for what would come next. Elrond's hand rested on a map. Fingers splayed over borders and names. He did not move them. He let the paper tell him nothing he did not already know. When he spoke, his voice was low. Words travel faster than arrows, he said, and the gathered felt the truth of it in the set of his mouth. A single sentence can become a banner or a blade. He looked toward the high arch, where the laughing had come, but there was nothing there now save the shadow of a man who had no name in their tongues. The laughter returned in fragments, a ripple from some unseen stone, and with it came small things that needled, half sentences, echoes of old grievances in new clothing. the tilt of a phrase that made an old truth look like a lie. Gandalf's pipe smoke rose and climbed, and did not wholly hide the curl of a smile that was not his. He rubbed his chin as if catching an itch, and then he shook his head. "We quarrel among ourselves," he said. "That is what he wants. When friends turn, foes are made." He kept his voice even, but his eyes were keener than the fire. Legolas stood, thin as a blade of wind against the house, and watched a leaf fall at the archway. "He sings with borrowed tongues," he murmured. "He takes our old songs and twists the words until the meaning breaks." His voice had no anger, it had only the cold alertness of one who discerns a pattern. Gimli's beard bristled as though with sparks. He tapped the table with a heavy finger. "Songs hold truth, and men's faces show it. I will not be mocked beneath my own roof," he said, and the room warmed with that plain, stubborn heat of grievance. Boromir stood by the door, pride straining his shoulders as though he were already bearing a shield. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of his city and the taste of its need. Words may be small, but their harm is measured by the hunger that receives them, he said. "We are not blind to hunger." There was a certain edge in him, the sense that a man's land and a man's honor were the first to feel poison. Frodo, quiet-eyed, drew the hood of his cloak a little closer, as if a draft could be kept out by fabric. He listened, and a slow worry threaded through his features. The laughing stranger, the thing that moved like a moth among the lamps, had not needed to shout to ruin the temper of a hall. He had only spoken to the right ear, let certain soft insinuations fall like seeds. That is the cruel art of him, not a single outright lie, but the rearrangement of fact and feeling. He fed a doubt here that an ancient pact had been kept only because one side had prospered. He fed a memory there, an old ballad made to sound like a slight. He showed a single unfamiliar face and said, "They have always loved themselves more. It was enough." Words like these find fertile places. Men and elves and dwarves are not magical in their immunity. They carry ancient hurts like hidden single stones in a shoe. The Joker, for so some called him now, did not pull the stone out. He simply named it. The naming made the hurt real, and the real hurt looked for a hand to hold. Eyes turned inward and found reasons. Allies glanced at one another with new measurement. A friendship that had been simple now counted debts and favors as if the ledger mattered more than the laughter shared beside a fire. Elrond rose at last. His robe fell at his ankles. The light traced the lines of his face and found them worn. "We came here to judge a shadow," he said. "But shadows are not the sum of all that is true. We must not let the cunning of one seek to rend what was woven long before his jest." He looked directly at each of them in turn, and where his gaze landed, words paused. Even so, the seed sown had sprouted. A quarrel had 1,000 stems. It began with a small thing, a complaint about a song. Merry had stood and cited a fragment from an old elvish hymn, certain in its meaning, certain of its goodness. A present voice, the envoy who had left, had answered with a cold twist, suggesting that the hymn had been altered, that older verses had been suppressed because they did not flatter some memory. The exchange sharpened. Voices rose like sudden weather, heated, gusting, merciless. Swords remained sheathed, but pride went to the edge of the table and tapped its blade against the wood. The Joker did not shout to fuel the quarrel. He had moved away from the circle and now lurked in the margins, hands in pockets, watching how men and elves and dwarves threw sparks. He made small faces at every argument, an invisible Pied Piper who delighted not in music, but in the strain of strings. Every jibe, every recalled slight he nodded to with that crooked grin. He let each small wound be bandaged badly or not bandaged at all, and watched the stitch unravel. Gandalf rose and crossed the room. His robe brushed the same stone the Joker had stood upon. For a heartbeat, the wizard's staff met nothing but cold air. Then he turned, and his voice filled the hall. "Enough," he said, and there was such a quality to that syllable as to make even the laughter curb itself at the edge. "We are men and elves and dwarves and halflings of one fate more than we are strangers who stir old sores. We must bound our tongues where reason demands it. We must not make the darkness with which we contend an ally to our own poor fears." He paused, and the silence that followed was thick as honey and twice as slow. Boromir's hand went to the hilt at his belt. He opened his mouth as if to answer. Then he looked to the window, where the river shone. Something passed over his face, an inner debate about duty that had nothing to do with words. He clasped his belt and left the answer unsaid. But the envoy who had left earlier did not return. He had made the choice that spoke more loudly than any retort. He had ridden away carrying a phrase in his head like a knife. Outside the gates, the envoy moved like a man with a purpose. He rode not with haste, but with steadiness. The poison in his speech was not to be wasted by panic. He knew which minds would take the seed and let it grow. He knew which leaders were primed by need and by long winters of hunger. He had listened to the Joker as one listens to a cunning merchant, learned the price of a word, and found he could profit by bringing it home. The valley swallowed him up, and those in the hall watched his shadow pull away and become a line across the map. Inside again, small factions began to form as if by some unspoken law of broken trust. Two would lean together and whisper, and then another would draw near. Old jokes were repeated with new meanings. A compliment became a slight. A compliment given in earnest would be answered with suspicion for a motive. Even the old stories told of the First Age were parsed as if they were political manifestos. The Joker's work was being done in the subtle arrangement of doubt, the turning of certainty into a suspicion that could be inhaled like smoke. Gandalf watched all this as a shepherd might watch his flock in winter. He saw which lamb strayed closest to the precipice, and which wolf wore the face of a friend. He moved as a man with both knowledge and urgency. "We cannot stand this idle," he said. "This thing, however named, sows not merely words, but an ethic of doubt. If it is allowed to feed upon our fears, it will turn to hatred as a fox to carrion." He spoke plainly. The words were there to be acted upon. He set a hand upon the shoulder of the nearest captain and looked him in the eye. "Find the man who rode," he said. "Bring him back if you can. Hear what was done in his ear. The poisonous seed must be examined while yet it is young." Elrond did not move at once. His eyes turned to the windows where the bread light of evening leaned like a hand upon the hills. He knew, as they all did, that the smallest act of misprision might bloom into war. He weighed the risk of pursuing an envoy against the risk of letting words travel unchecked. At last, he nodded. "Let two go," he said decisively. "A swift rider and a quiet mind. Take counsel and haste both." He named no names, and yet the choice was meant. A ranger who knew hidden ways and a messenger skilled in the reading of true speech. Legolas stepped forward without fanfare. He had the stillness of the trees in his bearing. Gimli grunted and met a dwarf's hand with his own. The movement was rough but sure. Frodo hesitated. Then he saw the look in Gandalf's face and understood that if the disease of words was allowed to spread, it might seek the smallest and softest places first. He volunteered because volunteering was a small defense against feeling useless. His voice was quiet but steady. "I will go," he said. There was a moment when the hall seemed to exhale. Plans took shape more quickly than they had in hours of arguing. Saddles were readied, hooded cloaks were drawn, a map was folded and refolded, as if by the touch it might transform into exactness. Yet even as they prepared to follow the envoy's track, there was the deeper unease that no man or elf had the map for, the mind of the laughing stranger. What did he seek beyond discord? What design lay beneath his grin? The answer was not in the east wind, nor upon the skin of the river. Gandalf's gaze fell once more upon the archway where the stranger had stood. He fancied he could still hear that laugh, a small sound that meant much and nothing. "He will not be content with one jest," the wizard said softly. "He will see whether we will be laughter or ruin." He turned then to those who would set out. "Go swiftly," he commanded, "and remember, the truest armor against a poisoned word is truth spoken plainly and held with courage." They stepped into the cool of evening with little fanfare. Their boots made small noises on stone, a metronome to the weight of what they carried. Elrond watched them go until their shapes were nearly swallowed by the dark. The hall closed around its silence again, but this silence had been altered. It was the kind that carries waiting rather than peace. In some corner of the house, the Joker's laughter unfolded like a map. Routes, byways, seeds. He moved unseen and unfettered his next idea, already forming behind his eyes like a lit match. The envoy rode, and the valley kept its counsel. What grew next would be no simple quarrel of friends. The night between the white towers and the grasslands was a thin thing, a cloth of breath and cold, and upon it the smallest whisper could be a blade. Horses stamped in the outer wards, men wrapped mantles tighter, and listened for the sound of hooves that were not theirs. Far below, along the western bulwark, a watchman cursed softly and thought he had heard a laugh, no more than a hiccup in the wind, but the sound nested itself like a seed inside his worry. Small things find root where fear has been sown, and the laughing stranger had sown fear as one might scatter salt. The Palantir, taken from its shadowed niche and set like a jewel on a table of oak, breathed false images into the dark, and the dark, eager for confirmation, made them true by what they chose to do with them. He touched the stone with hands that did not tremble. He made a mirage of a man the steward had trusted, seated at table with a captain of the Westfold, glass raised and a hand on a blade. He showed a banner torn and folded, a letter whose script was only half legible and full of the wrong names. Faces that had never met in truth were bound in the Palantir's eye and given voices that slithered into council halls. Leaders are like great bellows. They blow what is put before them into roaring fires. A lie offered from a crystal bowl will be fanned until it feels like ember and then flame. So it was that Minas Tirith and Rohan, not yet ready to strike against Mordor's known evil, redrew their lines for a different kind of war. Strike first, ask later, keep silent, doubt loudly. They began with the roads. Where cartrets had been open and hospitable, now iron posts were planted and chains stretched across the passes like a web. Watchtowers were stepped closer to the borders as if proximity itself might be a proof against deceit. In the stone of guard, men measure the remoteness of allies and enemies alike with the same tight, suspicious eye. Messengers who had for years ridden through the night with nothing but a trusted sigil and the scent of oats on their cloaks were now halted at gates. Their seals were broken and read aloud. Their words were weighed against a glittering, impossible vision. The eyes of captains drifted not to the faces before them, but to the reflection in someone else's cup. A rider's hand on a rein could become a confession in the wrong light. Gandalf watched these small violences as one watches a glass begin to crack. He had no taste for sudden melodrama, and yet there was a frenzy about the courts that rotted oaths more quickly than any blade. Once men and women betrayed the faith of a neighbor, he thought they would not merely return home ashamed. They would build barricades and act suspicion, and in that new edifice, confusion would lodge itself like a stone that could not be pushed aside. He leaned upon his staff in the high gallery and felt the very name of order grow thin in the mouths of those who should maintain it. That the Palantir could be used in such a fashion worried him in a way darkness and open malice never had, for malice has shape, and a malice can be fought. But this shapeless laughter contrived to make truth itself look like a lie. A rider of the White Company, an elder, hair threaded with gray, scar across his jaw, came in with a packet wrapped in oilskin and the wind of long road in his lungs. He bore alms and assurances from the Rohirrim, things men had trusted by habit rather than examination. Yet a captain who saw only the Palantir's invented scene called him a liar. The old rider's protest was a sudden, small sound. His mouth made a prayer he could not finish. He stood accused and made to kneel as if before a tribunal, and the look of a man who has been turned from friend to suspect bit deeper than any scald. It is one thing to lose a sword arm, it is another to have the world recalibrated so that every hand that reaches for you might instead be holding a dagger. Gandalf spoke then in public with the tone of a bell. He reminded men and women of things that had been plain truth until the stone drew its web through the realms, of the bearing of riders who had never lied, of the sound of a true man's oath. He called no names, and yet the names were in the room like smoke. Some listened. Others leaned toward the Palantir like moths to candlelight, seeing in it the confirmation they secretly desired, because secret terror had made them friends with suspicion. Words were not enough for all. Evidence was demanded, proofs that could satisfy minds trained now to doubt the very sun. The Palantir answered their hunger by throwing up another face, another betrayal finer than the last, and the bell tolled without answer. Meanwhile, beyond the known watch of Mordor and the Palantir's cruel misdirection, something else congealed that did not fit the pattern of old darkness. It gathered not in high halls, but in ruined places, where the roads were seldom walked and where the moon's reflection found gutters and broken mirrors. Outcasts came as if to a voice they had long been waiting for. A captain whose banners had once been proud traded them for mockery and a grin. A traitor who had lost coin and honor found in the stranger's games new profit, for disorder is a currency of its own. Crafty men who had grown tired of allegiances that bound them to predictable ends discovered that chaos had a profit margin. They fashioned a covenant of laughter and guile, and they called themselves, by a name that was less a title than a promise, the Harlequins' Pact. This new coalition moved like a thought that seeks to avoid attention by being everywhere and nowhere at once. They were unwilling to serve Sauron, too blunt, too brutal for their tastes, and yet they were eager to feed upon both sides, to turn kin against kin and shepherd fear into a harvest of advantage. Their raids were small, surgical mischiefs, a storehouse burnt of rhetoric rather than of meat, a letter of remit changed by a cunning hand, a sentry bribed to fall asleep and dream of his captain's treachery. They learned the grammar of the Palantir's lies and wrote their own sentences into the margins of war. Sauron, grim and slow, had spies and eyes set like spears. He was preparing his own designs, but these were leagues away from his ordering. Here was a force unbound by the cruelty that names itself in open conquest. Here was a cunning that sought the fracture, not the overarching fist. Gandalf felt the strangeness of it most acutely at the broken entree of a deserted watch. He rode by a path that had been a road for lover and merchant and found it replanned as a line of suspicion. People he had trusted in earlier days would now not only refuse a hand, but would suspect his own touch of enchantment. Friendship had become a transaction, requiring receipts. He heard, in the edges of conversation, the strange new proposal that perhaps all clear sight was a trap, that even the moon might be a painted wheel set in the sky to trick the gullible. He despised that cleverness which worships trickery for its own sake. It was a faith without honor, and that faith eats at the root of courage. There were near calamities. In the east fold, a column of riders, misled by a forged summons and a Palantir-shadowed whisper, rode to cut a supply train presumed to be a convoy of spies. They came to a crossing and found instead a cart of wheat and women who were fetching water. The leader hesitated, enough hesitancy to lose command in the heat of suspicion, and a shot rang out that sounded neither like brass nor like mercy. The aftermath was not shown in blood as any spectacle, but in the functional cruelty of new rules. Caravans now swallowed their lamps at night. Drivers rode with their hands empty and their hearts heavier. It seemed that once an oath is loosened, it unravels a good cloak into threads that snag on every branch. Gandalf decided he must turn the game. He understood the Palantir's hunger for spectacle and the Joker's appetite for contradiction. If false visions could breed mistrust, then public truth could be fashioned to fracture the liar's advantage. He did not mean to fight trick with trick. He meant to present an act so simple and so plainly true that it would be visible even to a stone bent to deceit. He would offer a sacrifice of certainty, a place, a time, and witnesses to cross-examine a vision. He would put a mirror not to the Palantir, but to the men who trusted it. And he would watch how they judged between the evidence of their own eyes and the impossible certainties thrown up by the crystal. To do this, he needed two things: trustworthy hands and a moment when the laughing stranger thought himself safe to play. He summoned an emissary of few words, one who carried with him the smell of fields and the steadiness of years. He chose a small company that had no taste for theater and no desire to be made part of a jest. He set them at an appointed time in the open square beneath the White Tower, and instructed them to do nothing but be what they were: farmers, smiths, riders, a man who mended shoes. They would light no torch, save what light the stars gave. Each would recite a simple truth, the pattern of a day's labor, the marks of an honest callous, the names of children. Gandalf hoped that to see a life lived plainly spoken might prick the Palantir's fabrications like a thorn. But the stranger is not idle. He knows the workings of laughter and how a single false note can drown a chorus. The Harlequins' pact would be listening for this very attempt to outflank them. Already, beyond the stones and the watchfires, men who like the taste of falsehood prepared countervisions to be set against the simple truth of the square. They would throw their own mirrors into the light and make witnesses contradict themselves in the face of doubt. The Palantir had become a stage and every man a player to be unmade. Gandalf did not step inside the square alone. He girded himself with the patience of old oaks and with a plan that threading truth through suspicion must be simple, not clever. He called for a signal to be held until the stranger could no longer be certain of the hour. He would wait, and when the first false vision came to light, he would not leap upon the stranger. He would do something subtler. He would force a choice. He would put two images on the table, one plain, one painted, and demand which the watchers believed. That demand was less a question than a lever. If men chose the painted thing, then the fracture would be complete and nothing could be mended by a single spell or a single speech. If they chose the plain truth, then perhaps beginnings could be made, a chain of small, stubborn trusts that might, in time, restitch the torn map of alliance. He looked to the east, where, in lands beyond Sauron's immediate gaze, the Harlequins' pact planned its next mischief, and to his own men who would carry faith into the square. The choice was not merely between true and false, but between a world that accepted being tricked for profit, and a world that would insist upon the grain of honest life. He put aside his fear like a cloak and took up action like a staff. Then, as the wind shifted and the Palantir blinked and a laugh like a bell faded into the night, Gandalf turned from the gallery toward the stone steps and descended. He had two plans and one hope. Either might fail. Yet motion, he knew, was a better defense than despair. The city learned to move like a thing newly trained. Where once children chased one another through alleys and hawkers cried their wares until the dusk swallowed their voices, now shutters clanged shut at sunset and torch-bearers paced the walls with the dull, regular footfall of men on oath. The decree had been plain and pitiless, curfew from bell to bell, gatherings halved, speech that incited unrest to be answered by counsel or chain. Messengers ran with the edicts, scribes copied them in a dozen hands wax seals, heavy and ominous, sank into the leather of each proclamation. For a season at least, there was order. Markets kept their hours. Roofs did not collapse under sudden mobs. The great roadways were not torn into maddened knots. Aragorn watched this new order from a high gallery where the wind had a taste of far hills, and the banners below snapped with a sound like a great bird winging. His face was weathered, and his hands, once quick with sword and song, trembled as he laid a palm upon the balustrade. He had sworn oaths not only to keep life, but to keep the shape of it. That vow had carried him through battle and mourning. Now it pressed him to choose, to answer the laughing stranger with laws that clipped his enemy's wings, or to risk that laughter unchained again. The choice had a salt in it, a curdling, as if a beloved wine had soured. He chose the law. The law, unlike a sword, leaves fingerprints. Men were told to bring forth those who smiled too long in the streets, to report jokes that cut too deep, to hand over trinkets that bore obscene marks. There were show trials, solemn as funerals, held beneath tapestries that had once heralded triumphs. A man was brought before the hall who had painted a face upon a bread cart and sung in mockery of the steward. He was not a great lord, he was a baker with flour in his hair and a child's laugh in his throat. The magistrate spoke of security and sedition, of the contagion of mirth gone to malice. The crowd watched without the twitch of a single cheering voice. They had been taught to fear the sound of laughter now, as if it might crack the pavements. Some nights the courts took men for words alone. A scholar who had argued in taverns that the realm needed a freer press found himself bound and humiliated. He had said once in a jestable mood, "If only a king could sit upon a jester's seat, what would he learn?" Now his speech was a blade that had been sheathed into the body of peace. Soldiers cuffed him. A scribe read the charges aloud. A child of the man, who had not yet learned to be afraid, clutched at a hem and asked why father would not come home. The child's question was simple, and it pierced more fiercely than any arrow. The crowd turned away. They had no answer that would not be treasonous. There were victories in the ledger. Saboteurs who had once bent metal in the dark were caught a planned conflagration in the grain sheds, failed because informants, newly emboldened, had come forward. For every night that the city slept without the footfall of masked madmen, a life had been spared that otherwise might have been taken in whim or terror. The lamps in the square stayed bright. Mothers folded their blankets without the full terror of listening for distant disturbances. Order had its warmth, yet the warmth was uneven. Where law smothered the edge of unpredictability, it also drew a long shadow. Men who had sworn oaths to protect the realm began to delight in the power that permitted them to decide which words were safe. A captain closed his eyes on a personal feud and called it sedition. A magistrate, once mild, polished the ink that signed the sentences as if he were gilding his own portrait. Old quarrels, the kind that linger like embers under a hearthstone, found new fuel. Slights were recast as treacheries. Family spats became public matters. The one-time instruments of peace took the shape of judges, and in their shapes they bore the blow of new arrogance. Aragorn felt it keenly. Reports came to him, names with little context, the kinds of names that could be any man's neighbor. Each report demanded attention, each demanded a seal from the king. He wrote some denials, some pardons, and more often than he wished, he stamped the paper and sent the men away to confinement. There were nights when he sat alone, and the room was full of his father's voice and of the songs of the North, and he thought of a freedom that had seemed plain and holy as bread. He had vowed to keep that bread. He worried that his hands, once called to break it for the people, were now tight and clenched. Outside the gates, the Joker watched with a patience made of teeth. He did not always appear in person. Sometimes he left a painted mask upon a statue. Other times, a scrap of verse that sprang like a nettle when read aloud. He delighted in riddles that startled the city into confessing itself. He understood, with an almost clerical delight, that the best way to mock a law was to force it into absurdity. A curfew enforced to stop a madman teaches men to fear the night that holds more than the madman. He sent riddles that asked whether a law that made men speak only true words could ban a poet's fancy. He sent a mimicry of a governor's edict, signed with a flourish, that required that all citizens greet the morning by reciting a loyalty pledged to a virtue none of them had heard taught. The guards who arrested the prankster were cheered by the crowd, but when the prank turned out to be nothing but a string of nonsense stitched to provoke, the cheer faded into an uneasy sound. The stranger's gambit, cruel and simple, was to make the defenders become like him. If the king would peel away freedoms to snuff out the laugh, then people would learn to shake at the sound of their own tongues. A poet stopped speaking because a single line might be read as fomenting disorder. A merchant bartered in whispers, lest a loud joke be framed as an incitement. Children grew up with their humor trimmed into safer shapes, and safety began to look like a conforming dress. The city had quiet, but in that hush lived a new authority, the fear of being seen to step out of the line. Not all accepted this meekly. In the gray undercroft of a monastery, where the roofs kept both warmth and whispers, a small band met by the light of a single guttering lamp. They were not outlaws of sword and hatred, they were poets and old soldiers. A tanner's daughter with hands that remembered stitches, a mason who had once been a singer. They called themselves by the old word for whisper, no proper name to give them a gravitas that might attract a patrol. They composed plays in secret, short and sharp, to test the seams of the law. A rhyme smuggled into a market pocket could travel farther than a sword and wound a conscience instead of a body. Their aim was subtle, to remind people that laughter could be a weapon for good, that mockery could expose folly without becoming it. News of these clandestine performances reached the palace by cords and confidences. Some were quick to dismiss them as further provocation by the stranger. Others, older of mind and gentler of heart, urged restraint. "We cannot be judges of all music," an elder counsel said, his voice threaded with the dust of long years. "If we become fearful of our own shadows, then the true enemy has already taught us to look away. But the ledger in which lives were weighed is a hard thing. For every voice that pleaded for mercy, there arrived a new scrap of evidence of mischief. An aristocrat's jewels scattered across the green, a cart of painted eggs smashed in the road, a child's face painted purple at dawn. The memos of such small outrages found their way to the king's table, and each was another olive pressed into the oil of law. Aragorn learned, as kings must, that laws are not the same as justice. A law reaches out like a net, justice stoops with hands. He could feel the net in his fingers and knew it was meant to hold monsters, but also knew it might catch those who had simply danced in a wrong place at the wrong hour. He spent long nights with his steward, poring over petitions, feeling the vertigo of choices he could not be certain would be right. A steward argued for iron, for lists and censors, for a body of men who would judge speech and mark its danger. "We must crush the spawn before it grows," the steward said. His fingers drummed on the oak as if the table were the drum of war. Aragorn heard the counsel and heard another voice beneath it, his own memory of a different war, a different enemy who had sought to make the world only of one form. He feared that in stamping laughter, he might be stamping a soul. Yet the thought of children burned in the street by a mad device, of whole houses set to ruin by whim, turned his stomach with a hunger for decisive acts. The weight upon him was not only that of the present, but of all the lives that would be lost if the stranger were allowed to roam. He had taken oaths to bear that weight. He would bear them even as they scarred him. The show trials eased into a cadence, and the streets, by the measure of casualty, were safer. But each night that the city slept without terror, the king woke more often. He woke to the sound of his steward counting, to the sound of his own name called in secret gatherings, and to a new note that had crept into his dreams, laughter that was close to his ear and yet made him feel like a child again. He could not filter it or strike it down without also striking at himself. Then came the thing that made his jaw harden like iron. A sealed box, small and light, was brought to the gate with a card pinned to it. The handwriting was a slant of old letters. The ink was a ridiculous shade of crimson. The card bore a single sentence: "You have made me a lesson. Let us see who will learn." Within the box lay a single playing card, painted with a grotesque, wry face. Around it was a strip of leather upon which someone had carved a map of a place the city called sacred. No sword had been offered, no flame, no one was fenced in by chains or coffins. What had arrived was a mockery, precise as a surgeon's blade. Aragorn held the card in his weathered hand, felt its edges under his thumb, and understood the warning inside it. The stranger did not need to thrust chaos upon the city. He could invite it to make itself in the defender's own image. To answer him with an iron law was to hand him another weapon of laughter, the knowledge that men will choose fear over chances of freedom. The king set the card upon the table and did not cover it again. His eyes saw the map, and his mind leapt to the faces of those he had made to vanish into silence. He saw the bakers, the scholars, the child with flower in his hair. He saw the quiet underground troop that met in the monastery. He felt the ledger of lives saved tilt alongside the ledger of liberties curtailed. He had already decided to demand order. Now he must decide what form that order would take. Would it be iron and absolute, or a measured law that bore the grain of mercy despite the risk? He called for a council that would be small and secret, men not chosen for zeal, but for counsel. They came at dusk, when the city was most obedient and no trumpet sounded. The steward brought parchments, a scribe held a candle whose light shook in a draught. Outside, hidden in the folds of the city, a small voice rehearsed a verse that would not be sung aloud. Inside, the king drew a slow breath and prepared to speak words that would bind the fate of many. He knew only this: whatever he chose now would not end the jesting stranger, but might instead teach the realm how to answer him. The gravest question turned upon one pivot: whether the realm would preserve its shape and so risk its people, or preserve its people and so change its shape forever. Aragorn placed his hand upon the map in the center of the table and looked up, and in his face lay the resolution of a ruler who had chosen once and would choose again. The hall was no longer a place for trumpets. Torches still burned in their sconces, but their light trembled as if reluctant to reveal all that had been said there. Where once great feasts had been held, low benches ringed an open floor. Faces sat in the half-light, women with soot on their sleeves, men whose beards had been cut short by worry, youths who had returned from the roads with hollowed eyes. A hush fell when the first voice rose, not loud, but steady as a plow. "I was blamed," the woman said, "for the bread that failed in my neighbor's house. They said I had cursed the mill. They spat and would not eat of my oven." Her hands lay upon her lap like folded clay. The hall drew breath as if it too listened that breath was a kind of mercy. One by one, those wronged stepped to the floor. Each tale was a small, painful unthreading of the jester's web. A shepherd told how laughing children had watched him, made to look a thief by a painted mask that the stranger had left in the field, a smith spoke of a shattering whisper that had turned customers away. A widow spoke of the night her husband's reputation was dragged through the mire, and how the town guard had laughed with the crowd rather than keep their shield to truth. The stories were not rousing cries for vengeance. They were quiet, precise acts of restoration. When the widow named the men who had shouted her shame, heads lowered, and apologies fell from mouths like dull coins finally spent. Rumor, the hall had learned, was a thing with teeth and hunger. It fed on gaps, on things unsaid, on grief newly raw, on silence held like a favor. The stranger had been its mouthpiece, but the people now found they could starve the beast by speaking plainly into its empty space. Where lies had been quick, slow truth took root. A song was lifted by a hobbit, with a voice like wind through barley small words. Old melodies turned accusation into remembrance. The chorus did not flatter, it listed names. It told where fires had kindled from a dropped lantern and where hands had worked to put them out. In these refrains, the community found a map back to each other. Not all hearts softened at once. Mercy, the elders warned, must be paired with remembering. Council decrees were written with ink that did not fade. Courts would reopen to hear the wronged. When those who had been swept into angry mobs came before the magistrates, they were asked to tell not only whom they had blamed, but how the jokes and the caustic laughter had made a meaning for themselves. Many who had jeered felt shame, some felt only relief. For the latter, the law had a different language. Fines and labors alone could not mend a broken trust. Some were tasked with rebuilding the roofs they had mocked, felling the trees they had cursed, singing in the places where their insults had echoed loudest. It was an awkward penance, and it felt like mercy, because it demanded sweat instead of blood. There were bargains struck in the smoky corners of taverns and by the riverbank where crows on the stones watched. A young captain of the watch agreed to take down the banner of his station, a symbol of arrogant enforcement he had carried like a second skin, for a season, and to learn again the names of the streets he swore to protect. In return, craftsmen would help the watch repair the holes in the city gates, and bakers would supply bread for the watchmen on long nights. Such trades were not clever deals. They were a kind of compensation that made the peace a shared burden. It was understood that some safeguards would remain. The watch would no longer be a force that spoke first and listened later. It would be a steward that answered summons and bore witness. Still, order came at a price. The laughter that had once been reckless and light now seemed dangerous to sing in open places. Street workers were required to post witnesses when assemblies were called. Public festivals were taxed with watchers whose faces were stern and whose fingers rested near sheathed blades. Old liberties, those nights when a man might walk alone between inns and feel only the hush of stars, were tempered by the presence of patrol. Mothers taught their children which alleys were safe and which had been the scenes of rumor-made calamity. Some called these measures cowardice, others called them care. The greater cost lay not in curfews, but in a small dimming of trust. The world felt more like a town under bell tower eye than like a green field where any song might rise. Yet even as the watch kept step, it was song and memory that did the real mending. Bards went through the markets with new verses. They did not make ballads of the stranger's tricks. They sang instead of deeds, of women who had refused to turn the other way, of a smith who refused coin offered for an injustice, of the baker who had broken her oven to give bread to the morning. These songs were not triumphant, they were exact. Names glinted like medallions under the lyrics. A tune could make truth linger in the mouth of a nation longer than a list of laws. In taverns where the jester's painted coin had once bought a laugh, people pressed fruit and bread into the palms of those who had been blamed, and the music that rose was softer than revenge. Memory did more than unmask lies. It reshaped the way the free peoples would commemorate their misdeeds. Where once triumphal arches celebrated victories in war, new stones were set with sober words, reminders that fear can be a seed bed for cruelty. A public ledger open to all bore witness to complaints and reconciliations. Men read it like scripture, sometimes with tears. Children were taught to ask what had happened, not whom to blame. The stranger's favored method, the small cracking jest that grew to a wall between neighbors, was countered by 1,000 small acts of naming and answering and singing. The stranger himself remained a shadow that turned corners but did not stay. Once, when a pickpocket chased by a jealous crowd sought to throw down a mask that bore the jester's painted grin, it slipped from his fingers and rolled beneath a cart. Men and women pounced, but the mask was already gone. Only a smear of paint and a scrap of ribbon remained. Later, in the market, a child found a coin that looked as if it had rolled off, a minstrel's cap. He brought it to the elders, who weighed the metal and smelled the paint, and the coin crumbled in their hands like a memory. The stranger had never fought them as an army fights. He had always fled like a stage player when the audience turned serious. Rumor could not be killed. It could only be named and fed with a different bread. Some demanded that the stranger be hunted and killed. Such desires are old and quick in the heart. But killing a story does not end its telling. The wiser counsel called for a different justice. Those who had used the jester's laughter to hide their own greed were named and held to account. Contracts were voided. Lands were returned. Where the law could not reach, communities bound their own bargains. So it was that a merchant who had sold false tales for profit gave his ships to a harbor of orphans. A captain who had traded rights for a jest took upon himself the watch of a border for a year. These acts were not theatrical. They were slow and clumsy, and mostly done in dim rooms where only the candle and the sea heard them. The stranger's last gift, if it could be called that, was a reminder that chaos favors theater. He had loved the stage. He had known how to make the smallest gesture appear like an omen. Now his theater was empty, but for a few props. A painted shoe with a buckle of brass, a card with a grin drawn in ink. These things were put into a chest in the great hall, not to be displayed as trophies, but preserved as evidence. A child who pressed her face to the bars and peered in said nothing. She only reached out and touched the wood. Her finger came away with a smudge of paint. An elder took that smudge and set it in a book. There it would remain as an ugly specked letter in the story the people wrote for themselves. Night fell that winter with more stars than before, as if the sky approved of the steadier ways below. But it was a different kind of watchfulness. Men and women lit lanterns not to see better, but to be seen. They passed the light from hand to hand like a promise. Every village kept a list now, names of those unjustly accused, names of wrongdoers who had mended their ways, and names of mouths who had spread the stranger's lies. The lists were not trophies, they were tools. They taught memory without the arrogance of judgment. They taught humility without the laziness of forgetting. There was, nonetheless, one unresolved thing. While bargains had been struck and songs sung, the strangers' laughter could still be heard in strange places. A trade caravan that crossed the waste swore they had seen a painted face peering from a broken wall. Fishermen told of a lone figure who had danced across a crumbling pier and vanished beneath a fog. No sword could reach such a thing, for it was no mere mortal, but a manner of mischief, an idea pinned to the air like a motley bird. Councils debated whether to bind the roads with laws or to teach watchfulness by example. Some argued for strictures that would make the stranger's stage too narrow to play upon. Others feared that too harsh a leash would make a new danger. The slow, cold order that looks like peace but tastes like rust. The last scene of this season was not the stranger's capture. It was a meeting under an old elm where children had tied ribbons to the low boughs and where an old woman named for no title sat cross-legged, mending a cloak with thread the color of dusk. She did not speak of laws. She sang a line from an old song and closed her eyes. Around her gathered those who had once been eager to punish and those who had once been eager to flee. They listened. Then a captain of the watch, whose hand still trembled from a winter that had changed him, said in a voice roughened by first learning the names of his streets, "We will keep the watch, but we will also teach our sons to ask and not to point. We will build our laws so that mercy may find a place in them." The old woman opened her eyes and laid the repaired cloak across her knees. "And we will keep our songs," she said, "for a song will call a man by his name when the road would rather call him by his fear." Above them, a crow settled on a bare limb, the sound of its wings like a sigh. Far off, where the road curved into the wild, a laugh that might have been carried by wind or the passing of a mad tail brushed the leaves and was gone. No blade was drawn, no chase was set. Instead, a young scout rose and tightened his cloak. He had learned that you could not kill a story, but you could follow its footprints. He walked toward the road, toward the place where laughter had touched the world, and in his stride there lay the decision of a people who had mended much and yet knew that vigilance must be chosen as often as kindness.